Welcome, everyone. My name is Denise Demese. I'm the Director of Faculty Development for the University System of Georgia. We are so glad you are here for this webinar, Facilitating Engaging Online Discussions, with Jim Berger from Georgia College and Marina Smitherman from Dalton State. Just a reminder to keep your microphones muted unless you want to talk, in which case, when the time comes, you're welcome to unmute your microphone. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim and Marina.
Thanks, Denise. Welcome, everybody. We're glad you're joining us. We hope that you will find this session useful. My name is Jim Berger. I'm from Georgia College and State University. I'm the director for the Center for Teaching and Learning. And I want to welcome and introduce my colleague, Dr. Marina Smitherman. Dr.
Hello.
Smitherman, if you will.
Hello, it's nice to meet everybody. I'm at Dalton State College. I'm the director of the new faculty academy there and do some other faculty development as well as serving as the chair of life sciences.
So we put together hopefully what you will find to be an interactive session on facilitating engaging online discussions, and we'll go through a little bit about different types. Let's start with this is who we are, and this is the topic that we'll be covering, both synchronous and asynchronous environments. It would help if I could speak more clearly. So let's jump in and talk a little bit about the purpose. And the purpose for today's session is to introduce different strategies and techniques for engaging in asynchronous and synchronous discussions. And hopefully you'll take away two things. You'll learn steps to make engaging asynchronous discussion questions and develop example prompts. And then you'll be able to identify favorite strategies for engaging synchronous discussions and apply them to your courses. So let's talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about asynchronous environments and what makes a good discussion board prompt. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and she will talk about synchronous environments. And so let's just jump in. So why do we use discussion board questions? Many of you may be sitting in here thinking the same question. And some of the answers to that is it provides an opportunity for your students and you to develop that sense of community with your students. It engages them in thought-provoking questions and ideas, trying new ideas out, and then sharing in what presumably will be a safe space for you and your students. For some people, we all recognize that learning is social. And so being able to sit and discuss is another way for learning, another mode for learning. It allows students to bring up confusing ideas, and you as the professor can observe patterns of thought, and that will help you to identify where people are confused or stuck, and then that would give you the opportunity to clarify and provide resources, and in the same vein, provide you with the opportunity to assess how your students are acquiring or learning the material as you're going on. One of the things I like to ask instructors as I work with them is, what is a good discussion board question? So my field is adult learning. I've got a doctorate in adult education from the University of Georgia. And so a lot of times people that I work with think about a good question is something like this. List 3 items related to how adults learn. And so as you can imagine, the responses are, well, 1, 2, 3, and then they're done. And sometimes you've got people that are going to get very animated and list 3 long paragraph dissertation type responses, or you're going to get them, one-word answers. And so that's really, the one-word answers are really hard to engage in that discussion board. And then the longer answers, yes, you should be able to see my PowerPoint. Are you all not able to see the PowerPoints?
We can see it, Jim.
Okay. Okay. So maybe a better question is something along this line. Please identify 3 items related to how adults learn. Describe how you have experienced each of these 3 items, and then pick one that you think was best for your learning process and why. And so you'll see in this question a lot more involvement in their thinking, and you've given them some direction on what they are to do with that information. The point there being that you want them to be much more engaged and involved in thinking about what they're going to write about and connecting it to their personal experience. So as you think about, and I'm sure you've seen many of these before, as you think about designing your questions, there are some steps that you can take that will help you design your prompts in your classrooms, in whether it's in your face-to-face classroom or your online classrooms. Typically, these are online discussion boards. And so the session today for our session is really focusing on those online prompts. And so the steps that I would recommend you take are these steps. So thinking about backwards design, identify what needs to be learned. And so it's important that you think about the concepts that you want your students to take away from your classroom, and what do you want them to gain from this process as they go through it. And then develop a question that will assess that knowledge. So as you can imagine, if you go back to the adult learning question, I wanted them to really not only demonstrate their experience with adult learning, but also demonstrate their knowledge of what adult learning is. And so they had to not only identify how they experienced it, but basic components of adult learning as it related to them. So you develop the question that assesses that knowledge, and then you administer it. You try it out, you give it to a small group of students or colleagues, you make them be your guinea pigs. And then you ask them questions about it. So you would ask them things like, what did you think I was asking? I was trying to ask this. Did you get that out of that question? What were your responses to that? And then you think about whether or not they are answering the question in the ways that you are wanting the question to be answered. Once you've received that feedback, then you make modifications to the question, and then hand that out to your students. Give it to your students and then analyze the results. Are they answering the questions as you are wanting them to? And if they are not, then you make modifications, then rinse and repeat. And so in that process, we want to focus on the idea that this is an iterative process. None of the questions that I started out 18 years ago as a faculty member were the same 3 years down the road or 5 years down the road. I would go through each of those questions and think through and look at the responses and tweak them so that I felt like they were getting the kinds of questions and giving me the kinds of responses that I was looking for. So one of the ways that will help you shape your questions is what I've identified or described here as the PEAR approach. And PEAR stands for personal. The question has to have a personal connection. So if you think back to the question that, the second question that I showed you all, I wanted them to talk about their personal experience with adult learning. So the next part of the PEAR approach is the experience. So they needed to talk about what they have actually done, not what they have seen others do, for example. And then they have to do something with it. So they have to think, they have to analyze it, they have to synthesize, they have to create. So they have to combine this in some way, shape, or form, rather than just recalling a response. They have to actually do something with it. And then they have to think about how it impacted them. Sometimes I'll ask them to think about what they did and what they would do differently. And in asking them the question of what they would do differently, that asks them to reflect on what they did, and then analyze that process, and then think about and create a different response. So again, we're shooting for those upper levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Kolb's learning styles, not that we want to treat or teach to a learning style, but we do want to recognize that some folks are looking for a concrete experience. And then you'll notice that this is in a circle. So many people think that they need to start with a concrete experience, then go to reflective observation, and then abstract. But actually the research shows that you can start anywhere in this circle. And you'll notice that there are two continuums. There's the concrete experience versus the abstract. And then there's the active experimentation versus the reflective observation. And if you think about moving your way around the circle, hitting all four of these components, then that will engage various components for each of the learners. And so what we've tried to put together in this approach is the use of each of these components in shaping those questions. So I want to give you an opportunity to try this out yourself. And I want to put you into groups, and I want you, before I do that though, I want you to take a couple of minutes to think about a question in your discipline. So spend 2 minutes. We're not going to talk to anybody just yet, but in a couple of minutes, I'm going to shunt you out into groups. And so I want you to think about creating those questions. And here's the direction. So create a question related to your field that includes each of the PEAR components. And just to go back really quick, the PEAR is personal. Does it have a personal experience? Does it have personal connection? Have they experienced this? Have they gone through this process themselves? What are you going to have them do with this? And then how are you going to get them to think about how it impacted them? And so I'm going to give you a couple of minutes and then I'm going to put you out into breakout groups. So take the next couple of minutes. I'm looking at 11:15, so at 11:17, I'm gonna put you out into breakout groups, and I want you to share with your partners in your breakout groups what your question is and how you feel that it addresses those four components. So take a moment and think through this, and in a couple of minutes, I'm gonna put you out into your breakout groups. Yes. Okay, I'm going to put you all into breakout rooms for about 3 minutes. You'll get a 1-minute warning right before you were pulled back. don't click on the blue button when you see it, because that'll pop you out of the breakout room. So I'm going to go ahead and put you in, and we'll see you on the other side. So hopefully you all created a question that you felt was helpful, at least got you started. It's not easy to create these questions, and as you continue to think about it, then you'll continue to tweak it, and maybe you get a chance to try it out and such. So some of the things that can help you as you continue to do this. So there are additional steps that you can use. You can connect the question to your readings that will ask them to dig deeper, maybe ask them to prepare for the next time. You can ask them to analyze the concepts in the reading. You can make the connection between what you're reading about in theory and their practice in their personal lives. You can ask them to try a thought experiment with something that you've read in the readings. And then talk about what they would do differently. So, okay, we tried it this way and it didn't work so well. So what would you do differently next time? And then pick classmates and argue the opposite. So one of the things that I try to do, and I'll share this, or we'll share this in our resources to be uploaded later on, is when you have them discussing things, many instructors like to say, okay, answer this prompt and then respond to 2 people. And as you can probably imagine, if you've ever had to do that yourself, answer this prompt is hard enough. Now respond to 2 people without very much context becomes even more difficult. So what I try to do is give them some direction that says, answer the prompt, connected to your life, connected to your experience, be reflective. Now, how would you analyze that, etc. Then when you respond to a student, tell the student what you agreed with or disagreed, but then also challenge the student. What would you like to have heard more about? What did you find your experience is different? Feel free to agree or disagree with the student, and that way you're more likely to get those back and forth discussions that you don't typically get in the answer the prompt, now respond to 2 students. So then the final thing that I want to share in this portion of the program is some helpful approaches. Faculty or instructors should have 2 deadlines, one for responding to the prompt, and then the second for replying to another student. Too often, students try to wait to the last minute to respond, and then, so they'll respond to the prompt and respond to a student, and conversation doesn't go so well for that. So what I have found helpful is you have this deadline to respond to the prompt. Some instructors will like to set it up so that you have this deadline to respond to the prompt, and you won't be able to see other responses until you respond, so that everybody gets the first blush response first. And then use a rubric. And one of the things that I'll share with you is the rubric that I've created, and you're welcome to create your own or take mine, modify it, use it exactly as it is. It's up to you. To show people, show your students, your learners what you're looking for. Provide some model responses so that they know how much is too much or how little is too little. And then ask your students, respond to address the following. And that's where I would say things like, respond to, what did you like? What did you not like? What did you agree with? What did you experience? What would you have liked to have seen more? That kind of thing. And so I want to open it up. Looking at some of the, do we have time for questions, folks? David is asking, how do you model a response without giving away the correct response? The way that I would approach that is provide a model prompt and then provide a model response. Somebody else has asked, do you provide model responses for each discussion thread? I tend not to. I would do one model response for a dummy prompt so that I'm not giving away the answer, but they see the level. Now, you have to understand, for most of my classes, they're master's level classes. So for my students, I want to model, thoughtful, critical thinking and use of the literature and the readings, the correct citation approaches, things like that. So mine may be more elevated than some of the responses that you might be getting for freshmen. So the things that I'm wanting to model are going to be different than the things that you're going to want to model. So Omen has asked, how long of a space should the response to another peer? I would say that really depends on the question and the topic that you're dealing with and the level of students that you're dealing with. It may be that as you are scaffolding your students into learning how to respond to discussion prompts, you can probably ask 2-3 sentence responses to peers, but I've seen for my master's students 2 or 3 paragraphs. It just depends on the topic that you're discussing and how in depth you want your students to be. I will share the rubric with the resources, but I'm not able to do it at this point. But basically, the components of the rubric are about, did they respond to the question? So the rubric really has 2 components. Did they respond to the question, the prompt itself, and did they respond to another student, encouraging more thought, etc. And so for me, my rubric is a 4-point rubric, and in that 4-point rubric is also proper grammar and lack of typographical errors, because I want to encourage them to see this as a professional space and to treat it as a professional space as well. I want to turn this over to Marina and hear what she has to say. So thanks for listening, folks.
Thanks so much, Jim. And hello, everyone. Thank you for choosing our session today. We appreciate you being here. So it comes to me to talk about the synchronous live chat. So what we're doing today, and some of the same basic principles of making it real world and applied still apply here as they do in the asynchronous environment. But before we get to a few different techniques, I'm going to give you an overview of some techniques, both low prep and high prep, that help. There are a couple of other things to attend to if you really want to get students talking. And oh, now I see I can't control the slide. So Jim, if you want to move on to the next slide. Thank you. So the very first thing is to create that community. And it was lovely to see today in just a couple of minutes, already as faculty, we were chatting about this subject that we're so passionate about with teaching. And this really has to be a start as you mean to go on, because if our goal is to support students in their learning and being able to critically reason and think and communicate using our disciplinary language, which is new for them, right? We have to get them comfortable first communicating with the group using their familiar patterns of thought and language. And so there are a number of different ways to do this before you even get to the discussion. Welcome videos is a lovely way of doing that, both for them and for you. And welcome discussions. And my favorite is an online profile, which to me, in my experience, has been the most important in the idea of community, because it's not all you, right? When I was teaching online this summer, I'd filled out my online profile joking with my students that I was glad that I'd already been up for promotion, because I didn't really want my colleagues knowing just how big of a Friends fan I am. But we had a student in the group who was very big on birthdays and celebrating, and she actually went through all of the online profiles, noted the birthdays, and then let us all know. We got cake, we sang, and it was actually the most wonderful way to create that group mentality. And I think that that was a good statement to me of it's not, the onus is not necessarily on us if we ask them to fill out those profiles, you know, favorite music, favorite movies, you know, that can create connections within the group quite nicely, was my experience. So those things help the students feel comfortable and get chatting. And the other thing, if we go to the next slide, Jim, The other thing is icebreakers, and I know it sounds cheesy, but icebreakers work. And so really, in my experience, if you don't get them talking day one, forget it. I have a wonderful colleague at Dalton State, Jerry Dry. He talks about the first class being like a first date. You sort of have to get it right for them to want a second one. And so the website that I've linked here has 21 different awesome ways to get students talking in that icebreaker session. And in fact, a mini icebreaker at the start of each session is a great way to get students talking. So for example, the 4 corners is one of my favorites. You would divide students into 4 breakout groups on the basis of their answer. If you won the lottery, would you spend, save, right, invest? Put them into groups, have them chat and come up with you know, commonalities between those groups. So we know that Caitlin Tucker provides, in the next slide, Caitlin Tucker provides a nice succinct list, in addition to creating community and icebreakers, that help us focus our minds on what will help our students get going. And a lot of these require forethought and preparation, which is challenging right now. But the very first of these is to provide the list of questions up front. And so, sorry, if we can go back to the previous slide. Yeah. So no worries. So providing an agenda so the students feel comfortable, and we know statistically adults need to know what's coming up, right? Adults feel comfortable as they're learning if they know what's happening. And so having an agenda and a list of discussion questions ahead of time allows them to start thinking about what their contributions might be. In the breakout session, Denise and Jim and I were talking about the fact that transparency and clearly communicating your expectations, you know, why are you asking them to have this discussion? Is it to get used to using specific vocabulary in your discipline? Is it to get them to come up with specific ideas or concepts, or use that you know, how does that relate to their lives? Why should they care? How's it going to help them with your class, both now and in the future? And how should they be responding? I think we talked about that a little bit already. The third thing is to give students the input, the creative input. And so maybe they want to generate their own questions, having done some reading, and you might select some of the best of those for the discussion. Can allow students to feel invested in the discussion if they've had some input into that. Like I said earlier, the fourth one is to consider starting each session with a little icebreaker. We've done this today, so suggestion 5 from her is to use the chat window and actually put your discussion prompts into that, allow it to serve as a back channel. So it does, I think someone made the point earlier, you are multitasking. It is a very different skill to teach online than it is face-to-face, and you're absolutely following both the chat and listening for students to speak. In fact, from my experience, students are much more likely to post in the chat than they might be able to contribute in a face-to-face class, depending on the instructor. And so using the chat window strategically can be a hugely beneficial thing. Sometimes having discussions in smaller groups in shorter sessions can be a good way to approach it. And always, her suggestion 7 is individual and peer feedback. And I think that, you know, if someone's spoken and shared, if they post in the chat, praise them by name. That's so much easier online because you don't have to learn the name. It's written for you. But using that name to build that rapport, encourage other students is a great way to go. So Jim, if we can move on. So if you're feeling like me about the fall and the amount of work that I have to do to get ready for the fall, maybe some of these low prep suggestions will appeal to you. But first, let me introduce you to the what I describe as the plight of the brilliant Socratic question. Because I see this all the time. So I'm very lucky at Dalton State to get to work with faculty across the disciplines and to work with them one-on-one on developing their teaching. And I think that I wanted just to use this slide, if you've seen the Ferris Bueller's Day Off. You know, here he is at the front of the class trying to engage the students in interesting details and start to have them think critically. And so I see faculty a lot posing absolutely brilliant Socratic questions. And, you know, as experts in our field, it's easy to do that. right? Because we have those neural networks in place. We see the association between A, B, and C, and so it's easy for us to make those connections. And yet, as students, they may not have built those neural networks, and so you know, giving them a minute or two to think about that often does get good suggestions from the students. And so actually simply giving them a minute. So the think, pair, share, as we already did earlier today, is the easiest of those because it requires no prep at all. We can easily create those Socratic questions as we're going. Just simply giving people a minute to think about it requires no prep, but often generates a lot of discussion and builds confidence that students can start to talk about the disciplinary language. Also very low prep is incorporating short 2 or 3 minute video clips. And this can work well both in the synchronous and asynchronous environments. And for whatever reason, those video clips can really get people talking because of the introduction of the media, perhaps a little bit less intimidating than we can be as faculty. So those can be a nice, easy ways to, you can embed those into asynchronous discussions and show a very short 2 or 3 minute clip before they start to discuss in class. And so sorry, Jim, next slide, please. One of my personal favorites, depends on what you're doing, but one of my personal favorites is TQEs, or thoughts, questions, and epiphanies, sorry. And this does absolutely require, a lot of these do require students to read the allocated materials ahead of time. And so you put them into small breakout groups, give them 15 to 20 minutes as a small group to discuss the readings and come up with all of their thoughts, questions, and epiphanies, and then pick just 2 of those from each group to go over into a large group discussion. That allows them to build consensus as well. And so we're going to practice that later, actually. So Jim, if we go on. So not really a discussion technique, but something that can really help students in classroom discussions is a technique called talk moves. And these are a couple of very basic suggestions here, but you can actually give them sort of a cheat sheet of these, or a list of standard ways to discuss your subject. Again, as experts, that's easy for us. I do that a lot when talking about infectious diseases, something that you know, disciplinary language is important, and if you want them to develop that, giving them a sheet of, okay, well, here's how you might interact and discuss is a nice way, face-to-face or online actually, of allowing them to feel comfortable doing that. So Jim, thank you. So if you want to try to get students to come to a consensus, maybe with something a little controversial, the Snowball's nice. You start sort of in a slightly non-threatening way, talking about a discussion in pairs, then build to a group of 4s, then build to 8s, and then up to a large group discussion. Now, what can happen sometimes with that, in my experience, is then you get one student with a slightly radical opinion or is dominating the conversation. And in that instance, you would move to the following technique. Jim, thank you, which is, hey, let's give it its time. All right, that's a valuable opinion student in your class. We're going to give them 5 minutes and 5 minutes only. So that can be referred to as pass the marker or hot seat. Give them a few minutes to air their thoughts, and give the class time to respond. And so that's a nice way to sort of hit it on the head. Another technique for dealing with that is parking lot. You can say that's a great discussion technique for another day, a great comment for another day. But giving that student a few minutes to air can be useful. Or if you prefer, doing a gallery walk, giving each student in turn a few minutes to present their reflections from the discussion that they've had. So whichever technique you use, one of the ways that I've found that really encourages participation and engagement, and also provides some accountability, is to adopt a collaborative form of note-taking, right? So so you can, Google is one of my favorites. Google Docs is easy, it's free. I didn't get any money from Google to say that, but there are some live blogging tools as well that allow students to collectively build a set of reflections and notes. And that's going to be a lot more than you might get through in a debrief or a large group discussion towards the end of that session. And so that allows them to have many different takeaways from that group. So if you want even more collaboration and you have sufficient time to prepare, there are some much higher prep methods, and mostly that's logistics for you. So that might be preparing readings ahead of time, putting students into groups, designated groups, and keeping track of that. And one of my favorites of these, particularly for the online environment, is the Jigsaw. And it's really good for taking a look at a wide variety of different content and opinions in one session. So that's going to be more than you could get through if you were just doing it in a very methodical way. So when I do this, maybe with a group of faculty, I might give them 4 different articles on the inclusive classroom. Okay, and so that does require people to have read those, which sometimes doesn't happen, but you put them into breakout groups first based on those that read the very same article. And that's nice because they get to feel like experts, and it also covers up anyone that didn't have a chance to read it or fully read it, right? So in small groups, those that read the same article get to discuss it and share their observations and feel confident in a summary of that article, having discussed it together. And so after that, so that maybe 15-20 minutes, you might actually then Jigsaw, which is assign the students into groups with every student read a different article. So you'd have a group of 4, for example, and they're going to take it in turns to summarize and describe their article to the group. So therefore, each student read 1 article, but they're going to benefit from the summary of all 4 of those articles. And then following that, you often do a large group discussion, pulling out and drawing together the salient points from all of those articles. And I think that's really nice. It's a nice, straightforward way to cover a large variety of different pieces of information. And every student feels invested and included in the group's collaborative efforts on that. Again, particularly if you're using collaborative note-taking. And I see a question, I'm going to go through it because I don't want to run over. We'll come back to the questions at the end. So another one is, and this is kind of fun, so is what we call a hatful of quotes. And again, this requires preparation in the sense that the students will do some reading and submit their written response to you ahead of time, either in a Dropbox or email or in a chat window. And the nice thing about this is that you can combine these then not just with the students' opinions, but also maybe yours or outside opinions in the field. And then you drop a different response back to the student, who then will share it out loud. And that may or may not match what their own opinion was, which can be, really interesting then for discussion. And it's a way of including outside opinions without necessarily being overly involved yourself. Sometimes with discussion, you're like, oh, I hope they get to this, or I hope they get to that. And that can sometimes limit the discussion. And I would recommend in general to limit your involvement as an instructor as much as possible and be much more of a facilitator. And so that's a nice way to make sure that valuable opinions get aired if the students themselves don't come up with those. So another one that I've used with mixed results, and it really just depends on the personalities of the group, because some students love the limelight and others just don't, is doing a fishbowl and picking a small subgroup of students to have a very focused discussion while the others listen and kind of either collaborative note take or summarize what the discussion was about. And sometimes that can be hard if other students don't want to dive in as well. And so I use this mostly if I've got students that have clinical expertise, because I teach human anatomy physiology, and they've seen different diseases, and I have them talk about and share their experiences of working with patients in the field where the other students may not have that experience, and they can benefit from listening to that. So sometimes it works great, and sometimes depending on the personalities, that can be challenging. So similarly, a debate where you actually pick, I'm sure everyone's familiar with these, but online those can be fun, where you put students into two teams. I tend to poll them first and say, hey, what's your opinion on this? Are you for or against? And then put them on the opposite side to defend the opposite viewpoint. But because in science you have to have that ability to have the for and against argument, and then argue both and come up with a rational end solution. So, students present those two sides of the argument. That works really well with competitive students if there's a vote at the end where we're going to vote either for or against. So that can work really well in the online environment. Let's see. So we talked a little bit already, so I'm not going to spend too long on that, but capturing all opinions is a good thing. One of my favorites, we've used the chat box for that today, is Mentimeter, which is that first top left image there, where unlike Kahoot, which is in the bottom left, which is sort of multiple choice capturing of opinions from the whole group, which can absolutely work online just as they can face-to-face, Mentimeter is a really great tool for capturing longer responses. And so you can ask, for example, if I was to have it up now and say, does anyone have any questions if we didn't have access to the chat? You can post very long questions and scan through those pretty quickly and pick up on important points. And so that's a nice way to get all students engaged. Whether you get to every single one of those questions, they feel like those questions were aired, and you can always go back to them later on and respond to those students individually, or do a group response as a threaded discussion if interesting things come up that you don't have time to address at that point in time. And so the last couple of techniques really sort of go hand in hand, and they're two different approaches for really having very meaningful discussions. And I see a great question about working through Canvas, and I'm afraid I use Brightspace, D2L Brightspace, and so I'm gonna have to leave that for someone else. But my experience of Kahoot and all of those classroom response systems is they're internet-based. And so if you're using an internet based system, it should work. So I've had no problem using those in Brightspace. So Well Cafe and Cocktail Party are two ways to have meaningful discussions. And I think that one of the nice things about this is that online we've done I call this pizza party. We're going to have a really meaningful discussion about something important. We're all going to get a coffee, or we're all going to get a pizza to create that environment that we're all together. We're all in this together. And so Cocktail Party is random groupings. The Well Cafe is a little bit more more organized, but it's designed for meaningful conversations on big topics. And so I've done this actually as an icebreaker. I think it works quite nicely as an icebreaker, because people are often terrified of the subject that I teach. And they'll come in, and I'll put them in one breakout room and ask them the first prompt. What are you looking forward to in this classroom? What topics are you looking forward to, so I can get an idea of what their preconceptions are coming in. And they have maybe 15 minutes to discuss that and come up with, either through a whiteboard or a collaborative note-taking technique, come up with their major things as a group that they're looking forward to. And then you rotate all but one student into a different breakout group. So they're then meeting and talking to another set of students. The student that stays behind actually summarizes the previous conversation to the new group. And then you give them a second prompt. So, in this instance, in this example, I might say, well, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of with this class? And that airs those. And again, they will have those discussions. And it's a slightly authentic way, which is a little different from the cocktail party. That's random groupings. I might do this with a faculty member and say, for example, what does the inclusive classroom look like to you? And obviously, you've got a wide variety of different opinions, and we rotate the groups as you would if you were bumping into someone and continuing that conversation at a cocktail party. I think that's, again, as the faculty member, you're really just facilitating. You're not necessarily asking for feedback and reflection at the end of either of those two things. but those can be fun, like I said, even as an icebreaker as well. So I know that was a lot, so I gave you quite a few high and low prep strategies, and so I'd like to give you a few minutes here just to reflect and apply, and those of you that didn't quite get a chance maybe to talk about your asynchronous prompt, you could do that as well. And so just take a few minutes to think about which of these strategies sort of initially appeals most to you, and pick one and develop it for your fall courses. And then we're going to put you into breakout rooms and ask you to come up with, as a group, as you share your ideas, 2 thoughts, questions, and epiphanies.
Excuse me, we only have 8 minutes left in the
Right.
session? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, we're not going to have long. Unfortunately, an hour is not long to go through as much material as we've covered today. So as earlier, we may not have very long for this, but I think it's still worth doing. So I'm going to give you a minute to think, and then I believe Jim should be inviting you to a breakout here shortly. And I will put these prompts into the chat so that you have them. I'll look forward to seeing what you think. And so Denise shared some excellent ideas that I missed in the chat while I was focusing on getting through what I wanted to say today. But one of the questions that Denise had it was the which platforms had the online profiles. My understanding is that any learning management system has that kind of inbuilt, so students can upload their photographs, they can upload their favorite movies, music, that kind of thing. So that is built into every learning management system platform that I've worked with. And so whatever it is that you use, it certainly is in Brightspace, allows the students to go in and fill that out. It's a super helpful thing. And I think someone else asked a question about monitoring collaborative note-taking. I do from time to time, but I think it's much more to help the students maybe then respond if they're going to do a written assignment, take away key points they may have missed as they are engaged in the discussion. And so that's not something I sort of monitor or grade. It's really just as a group to keep track of things so we don't forget good points. So does anyone have any epiphanies or thoughts or questions they want to share for either me or Jim as we wrap up today?